She stepped in his front porch with her daughters and nothing left to lose. A widow's black bonnet, 2 hungry girls, and a promise to build something better than fear. He opened the door not expecting grace, only a cook, maybe a little quiet company. But in a house made of silence and regret, Leona Harper laid the first brick of something different, and when trouble came for what they built, they didn't flinch. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is choose to stay. If you believe even the loneliest place can become a home, stay with us. The mansion rose from the prairie like a question no one dared answer. 3 stories of weathered clapboard and imported wallpaper stood alone in the summer heat, its tall windows reflecting nothing but endless blue sky, and the drifting shadows of buzzards circling high above. At dusk, when the cicadas fell quiet, the house became a kind of monument, to ambition, to loneliness, to the cost of building something no heart could fill. They called it the Rock Place, though no one knew whether the name came from the man or the land itself. Maybe both. Gideon Rock sat on the wraparound porch with a ledger balanced on his knee, pencil tapping the margin in a steady rhythm. He had the face of a man who'd spent 20 years bracing against wind and sun, a face carved into stern lines that softened only when memory threatened to creep in. His boots were dusty to the knee. His hands, though clean, bore the permanent trace of old barbed wire cuts, as if the land itself had written its claim on his skin. Inside, the great rooms waited, shuttered against the glare, filled with furniture chosen for respectability rather than comfort. A piano sat silent under a sheet. A long dining table gleamed with polish no one ever disturbed. The air was thick with the smell of cedar beams and emptiness. He had built all of it, the fences that stretched beyond the cottonwoods, the barns with roofs he'd mended himself, the herd he'd doubled through cunning and sweat. He had once imagined a family here, imagined the sound of laughter and small footsteps on the stairs, but the women he'd courted had found other futures, or none at all. And so the house became what the land demanded, a fortress of solitude, a citadel for a man who had outlasted every rival except the hollow ache behind his ribs. He told himself often enough that it was better this way. No entanglements, no grief, no one to bury but cattle in lean years. Still, there were nights when he woke in the blue hour before dawn, feeling the silence pressing against him like a hand. He was not young anymore. 42, though some days he felt twice that. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples, and the skin around his eyes had begun to thin, revealing the tired blood beneath. He watched the road as the sun lowered itself behind the mesquite trees, scanning for any movement along the rutted trail that led back to town. But there was nothing, only the hush of evening settling over the grasslands and the soft groan of the porch timbers cooling in the dusk. He tried to imagine that the stillness was peace, not loneliness. But a man could lie to himself only so long. When he finally stood, the ledger tucked under his arm, he paused in the doorway and looked back across the yard. A single windmill turned, slow and deliberate, its blades catching the last light like an old clock measuring time that never belonged to him. Beyond that, the fields rolled away in waves of brittle grass, and the cattle moved as dark shapes against the gold. He had everything a man was supposed to want: land, livestock, respect. But the house felt no more alive for any of it. In all that wide country, there was not a soul to say goodnight to. And so it was that he made the decision to place an advertisement in the Pine Hollow Ledger, offering respectable wages to any woman willing to cook and keep house for a man whose needs were simple. He did not expect an answer, and if one came, he did not expect it to matter. A cook could fill the pantry, perhaps soften the air with the smell of bread or soap, but no stranger could fill the rooms with the kind of life he'd once dreamed of. That was a story for other men, other houses. Yet even as he wrote the notice in his precise, uncompromising hand, some small part of him felt the old, stubborn hope flicker, like a coal buried in ash. He folded the paper, sealed it, and watched the dust devils dance across the yard as if the land itself was laughing at his reluctance to believe in anything but work. Leona Harper arrived on a morning so bright it seemed almost cruel. The stagecoach rattled down the last stretch of clay-packed road, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the air long after the horses halted before the mansion's front steps. She stepped down carefully, smoothing the dark skirts that had grown too loose over her hips these past lean months. A widow's black bonnet shaded her eyes, but nothing could soften the set of her mouth. Determined, wary, worn thin by the kind of losses that do not make room for softness. In her arms, she carried Ruby, the smaller of her daughters, her legs gone to sleep during the journey. Beside her, Nell stood silent, one hand gripping her mother's sleeve, the other clutching a small ledger book to her chest as if it were a shield. For a moment, no one came to greet them. The only sound was the restless shifting of the horses and the wind brushing over the eaves, carrying with it the scent of sun-warmed cedar. Leona felt the familiar clench in her throat, that flicker of doubt she'd carried all the way from the edge of the Sabine River, that this was too much, that she'd overreached, that she should have taken a smaller position in town and accepted the slow dimming of her prospects. But she had promised the girls something better, and pride, perhaps the last thing left to her, kept her spine straight. The door opened at last, and Gideon Rock stepped out into the hard light. His shadow stretched across the porch boards, long and unbending. For a moment they simply regarded one another, the man who had built this place with his own hands, and the woman who had come to make a life in its shadow. She saw in him no welcome, but neither did she see contempt. Only the guarded reserve of a man who had long ago learned not to expect much from anyone. She could work with that. Respect was more than she had known in her marriage. Respect might even be enough. He descended the steps with measured care, as if uncertain how to approach a woman carrying both a child and the burden of fresh widowhood. His voice, when it came, was low, scraped raw by disuse. "Mrs. Harper?" "Yes." She adjusted Ruby's weight against her hip. "Leona Harper. These are my daughters. Nell is 11, Ruby is 6. His gaze shifted to the girls, lingering a moment on Nell's solemn face and the way her small hand tightened on the ledger. Then back to Leona, his eyes the color of iron filings, not unkind but unyielding. "You're early." The coach made better time than expected. She did not apologize. "I thought it best to arrive before the heat set in." A brief nod. He looked past her to the road, as if confirming no other wagons trailed behind. Satisfied, he gestured toward the door. "Come inside. It's cooler in the hall." She climbed the steps slowly, feeling every hour of the journey in her bones. The air inside was indeed cooler, but it was also dense with the hush of a house that had not known laughter in years. She felt Ruby stir against her shoulder, lifting her head to look around with wide, uncertain eyes. Nell slipped past her to stand near the threshold of the parlor, peering in at the covered piano and the tall curtained windows. "This was my wife's parlor," Gideon said, his voice so soft she almost missed it. "It's not much used." Leona met his gaze, searching for some sign of regret or yearning in those lined features, but there was only a flicker of something she could not yet name, something like shame or grief, quickly swallowed. She inclined her head in silent acknowledgement and shifted her attention to the long corridor leading toward the kitchen. Even through the closed door, she could sense the emptiness waiting there. She would fill it. She had no other choice. As Gideon led them deeper into the house, the girls trailing close, Leona felt the first tremor of something she had not allowed herself in months. Not hope. Hope was too fragile. But perhaps a readiness to believe that even in a place built by solitude, a woman's hands might kindle a little warmth. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to remember this moment. The bright morning, the hush of the hall, the feel of her daughters' small bodies pressed close as if to remind her they still belonged to one another. The first days were a quiet negotiation. The mansion absorbed them without comment, offering no comfort and no protest as Leona began the slow work of claiming each room. In the kitchen, she unpacked her small trunk, worn aprons, a wooden spoon polished smooth by years of stirring, 2 chipped mixing bowls she could not bear to leave behind. She set them on the counter as if by their mere presence they might drive out the stale smell of dust and old ash. Ruby clung to her skirts those first mornings, watching in solemn fascination as her mother swept the hearth clean and laid a fresh fire. Nell, more restless, wandered the halls with her ledger tucked under one arm, recording everything she saw in her precise, looping script. They found no softness in the man who owned the house. Gideon rose before dawn, drank his coffee in silence, and vanished into the pastures. He returned long after sunset, his face shaded by the brim of his hat, his boots leaving a trail of dry mud across the threshold. When he spoke, it was in brief factual statements: what repairs needed doing, which supplies should be ordered, whether the girls were settling in. He never asked about Leona's past. She never offered. This, she decided, was the agreement between them. She would bring life back into his house, and he would give her daughters the security they had never known. Nothing more. But at night, when she sat alone by the kitchen hearth, she sometimes wondered if the silence between them was simply the absence of feeling, or if it was, in its own way, a kind of respect. She had known a man whose voice filled every corner of a room, whose anger left no space for her own thoughts. This stillness was unfamiliar, but she could breathe in it. She could think, and sometimes as the fire burned low, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was enough. The girls adapted in their own ways. Ruby claimed a corner of the kitchen as her small dominion, lining up a collection of pine cones and scraps of cloth as if they were precious treasures. Nell spent hours at the big dining table, poring over the old ledgers Gideon had left stacked in neat rows. At first, Leona discouraged her. She did not want to give offense, did not want her clever girl to be thought meddlesome. But Gideon surprised her. One evening, finding Nell bent over a page, he only nodded and said, "If you see something that doesn't add up, best you mark it. Been years since I looked close." After that, Nell worked with a quiet diligence that bordered on reverence. Numbers made sense to her in a way people never had. She found discrepancies in the tally of cattle sold, subtle shifts in supply orders that hinted at theft. She marked them in the margins with a steady hand. Sometimes Leona watched her daughter's bent head and felt something rise in her chest, a strange, fierce pride that almost made her ache. In the afternoons, when the sun baked the yard to a brittle crust, Ruby would drift to the back porch, peering through the slats of the railing at the wide, shimmering fields. Once Leona followed her out and sat beside her, both of them watching the wind ripple through the grass. Ruby turned her solemn gaze up and whispered, "It's so quiet, Mama. Is it always going to be so quiet?" Leona brushed a stray curl from her daughter's cheek. "Not always," she said, though she did not know if it was true. Sometimes quiet is just what comes before something good. And in that moment, as the cicadas began their evening chorus, she felt the first slender thread of connection binding her to this place. It was nothing she could name, not yet, but it settled somewhere deep in her chest, soft as a promise. She would not let the silence swallow her. She would not let it swallow her girls. In this house of shuttered rooms and old sorrows, they would build something, even if it was only the memory of having tried. It began with bread, a simple thing, a round of yeast dough rising beneath a damp cloth, its quiet alchemy filling the kitchen with warmth that the hearth alone could never summon. Leona woke before dawn to knead it, her hands moving with the same steady purpose that had carried her through grief and hunger. When the first loaf emerged from the oven, its crust golden and crackling in the cool morning air, she placed it on the windowsill to cool. For the first time, the kitchen smelled like a place where people meant to live. Ruby stirred from her pallet by the stove, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She stood, bare feet silent on the worn boards, and pressed both palms to the table's edge to breathe in the scent. "It smells like the cabin in Louisiana," she whispered, voice featherlight with memory. Leona did not correct her, did not remind her that the cabin had never smelled like this, that there had never been enough flour or firewood to make something so fine. Let her remember it kindly. Let her remember it warm. By midday, Nell had carried a thick slice out to the porch, where she sat cross-legged under the shadow of the sycamores, ledger forgotten in her lap as she chewed. Leona watched her daughter's shoulders loosen, watched the lines of worry ease from her young face. It was not much, a crust of bread, a moment of stillness, but it was more than they had known in too long. When Gideon returned that evening, the scent of baking still clung to the hall. He paused in the doorway, his gaze shifting to the loaf resting under a clean cloth. For a heartbeat, something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or the memory of a time when a house might greet a man with warmth instead of the cold echo of his own footsteps. He said nothing, only removed his hat and set it on the peg by the door, but when he sat at the kitchen table, His hands were careful as he broke the bread, careful as if he feared it might vanish under too much weight. They ate in a silence that was different from all the other silences, less like emptiness, more like waiting. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the smell of dry grass and the first hint of autumn. Inside, Leona felt the hush begin to soften around the edges. She glanced up once to find Gideon watching her with an expression she could not read, his thumb brushing a stray crumb from the tabletop. There was nothing tender in his gaze, only a quiet regard that seemed almost more honest than kindness. She found she did not mind it. The days unfolded in slow increments. The kitchen became their common ground, a place where the girls could laugh without fear, where Gideon might linger a moment longer each evening before retreating to his ledgers. Sometimes he would bring in a sack of flour or a basket of apples without comment, setting them by the hearth as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Leona learned to accept these small offerings in the spirit they were given, without debt, without expectation. At night, when the girls were asleep and the fire burned low, she would sit at the table and close her eyes, letting the hush settle around her like a quilt. She thought often of her late husband, of the hard hands and hard words that had shaped so many of her choices. She thought of the narrow rooms where she had once believed herself safe, and she thought of this house, vast and unwelcoming, which was somehow becoming the first place that felt wide enough to contain both her sorrow and the fragile seed of something better. She did not know what Gideon carried in his silences, did not know if he ever thought of her beyond the bounds of her duties. But sometimes, as the night stretched on and the wind moved over the eaves, she felt a strange certainty that she was not entirely alone in her remembering, that somewhere behind his steady gaze and blunt words was a man who knew the price of loss, a man who might, if only in the smallest of ways, understand the shape of her grief. It was Nell who found the first proof that the ranch was being slowly stolen. She had taken to spending her afternoons in the study, her small frame dwarfed by the high-backed chair and the tall stacks of ledgers Gideon had left to gather dust. Numbers had always made sense to her, more sense than people, more sense than any sorrow she could not name. She ran her finger down each yellowed page, her lips moving as she counted. Columns of cattle tallies, feed purchases, and supply orders scrolled under her gaze like a secret language she alone could read. One evening, as the light faded to a dull copper in the windows, she came into the kitchen holding an open ledger against her chest. Her hair clung damp to her forehead, and her voice was steady but tight. "Mama, these numbers don't match." Leona was rinsing potatoes at the sink. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw the look in Nell's eyes. Calm, resolute, unafraid. "Show me." Nell set the book on the table and flattened the creased page. "Here, and here." She tapped her finger against two entries, one listing a shipment of fencing supplies, another a sale of cattle hides. "They're the same month, but the tallies don't line up with the receipts." Leona felt her stomach tighten. She had no head for accounts, but she trusted the clarity in her daughter's voice. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Nell said simply. It was not just theft. It was the kind of slow sabotage that could starve a ranch to death before a man ever knew he was under siege. And Leona understood in that moment that they were not merely guests here. They were part of a fight that had begun long before they arrived, a fight Gideon had been waging alone. When Gideon came in that night, Nell did not hesitate. She met him at the threshold, ledger open, small finger marking the proof. Leona held her breath, half afraid he would bristle, that he would see only an intrusion. But he listened in silence, his eyes moving between the page and Nell's solemn face. When she finished, he reached out and rested one broad hand on the book's cracked spine. "You're sure of this?" he asked. Nell nodded. His gaze shifted to Leona, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded flicker there. A quiet astonishment, as if he had not expected any living soul to stand beside him in this. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll see to it." After he disappeared into the study with the ledger in hand, Nell stood motionless in the kitchen, her shoulders rigid as though bracing for reprimand. Leona knelt and drew her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, feeling her daughter's small heart thumping against her ribs. "So proud." The following morning, Ruby, whose curiosity was the equal of Nell's precision, discovered the old spring house. She had wandered beyond the kitchen garden while Leona hung the wash, trailing her hand along the crumbling stone foundation that sloped toward the ravine. When she called for her mother, her voice carried bright with wonder. "Mama, come see!" Leona came running, expecting a snake or a broken fence. But when she reached the clearing, she saw Ruby crouched beside a sunken doorway half hidden by ivy and briars. A faint trickle of water glimmered in the shadows, clear and cold. "It's a house for water," Ruby whispered, awed. "Did people used to live here?" "No, sweetheart." Leona brushed the hair from her daughter's face, heart lifting in a way she could not explain. "They built it to keep the spring from drying up." She knew without asking that this was no ordinary ruin. This was the old spring house Gideon had once mentioned, its location long forgotten, its existence half legend. In a country where every drop could mean survival, such a discovery was no small thing. That evening, she told Gideon what Ruby had found. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to decide whether to believe. Then his mouth curved in a rare, startled smile, a soft, unpracticed thing that made him look almost young. "Well," he murmured, voice rough, "you've brought me more than bread." Leona felt something warm uncoil in her chest. Perhaps this place was beginning to give something back. Perhaps they were not only mending the house, but unearthing its hidden strengths. The sabotage began in earnest once Creighton realized the ranch was stirring to life. He had always counted on Gideon's isolation to make the land easy pickings, on the slow erosion of a man too proud to ask for help, too tired to fight every battle alone. But now there were fresh eyes in the ledgers, fresh hands mending fences, and a hidden spring that could outlast any drought. So Creighton changed his tactics. Where theft had been a slow bleed, he brought violence in broad daylight. It started with the fences. One morning, Gideon rode out to the north pasture and found the barbed wire sheared clean in 6 places, the posts hacked to splinters. Cattle prints led away in a confused scatter, hoofbeats trampled deep into the dust. He dismounted and knelt, pressing his hand to a fresh print as if he might read in the shape of it the name of the man who left it. He knew. He knew the same way he knew the shape of a storm cloud when it blackened the horizon. When he rode back to the house, his mouth was a flat, grim line, and he did not look at Leona as he strode through the door. That night the ranch was too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Leona sat by the kitchen stove, her mending forgotten in her lap, and watched the shadows deepen in Gideon's eyes. It was the same look she had seen in the mirror after her husband's funeral, resignation, and something colder beneath it. A certainty that if help was not coming, you must do whatever was necessary to survive. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded scraped clean of hope. "He means to drive me off this land. Has tried every year in one way or another. But I reckon he's tired of waiting." Leona swallowed, folding her hands tight. "Then we won't wait either." He looked up at her then, truly looked, as if seeing her not just as a cook or a mother but as someone whose will might equal his own. A flicker of something passed between them, recognition, or perhaps a shared defiance. It steadied her. It steadied them both. They began to prepare in quiet earnest. Nell copied every ledger entry and notarized it in town. Gideon rode to the courthouse, braving Creighton's men who watched from the boardwalk with cold, amused eyes. He came back with affidavits and sealed papers signed by the territorial governor, proof the ranch belonged to him by right, not rumor. Leona dried her hands on her apron and held the papers as if they were more precious than gold. But Creighton was not finished. One night, the cattle stampeded. Leona woke to the thunder of hooves pounding the earth, the frantic bawling rolling through the dark like a storm without rain. She ran to the porch, Ruby clinging to her skirts, and saw Gideon and 2 ranch hands riding into the chaos, lanterns swinging. Sparks flew as the herd crashed against the fences, the smell of dust and terror rising in a choking wave. She pressed Ruby's head to her belly and watched until the last of the lantern light disappeared into the black. Only then did she let her fear show, her hands trembling as she stroked her daughter's hair. Behind her, Nell stepped out into the cold, her ledger clutched to her chest like a talisman. "He won't let it go, Mama," Nell whispered, her voice flat with certainty. "He won't stop until he has it all." Leona looked out over the yard where the dust still hung like smoke and knew her daughter was right. But she also knew something else, something Gideon's grim resolve had taught her. This place was worth fighting for, not because of the land itself, or the cattle, or the house with its silent halls, but because here, at last, she had the chance to build a life that belonged to her and the girls, a life shaped by their own hands, their own choices. She turned back to Nell, her voice calm as she drew her into her arms. Then we won't stop either. In the dark, the two of them stood together, mother and daughter, each holding to the other as if they were the last true thing in a world that could be swept away overnight. And perhaps they were. But in that quiet, the fear began to loosen its grip. Because in the deepest part of her heart, Leona knew there was no power in this world stronger than a woman who has decided to stay. The confrontation came at dawn. The sky was the color of a healing bruise, purple giving way to a sickly yellow at the edges. The clouds strung like torn cloth across the east. Leona woke to the smell of dust rising, the air already hot and close. She knew before her eyes were fully open that something was about to break. When she stepped onto the porch, Gideon was waiting, one hand resting on the rail, the other wrapped around a rifle he did not bother to hide. In the yard, 3 riders loomed just beyond the fence line. Creighton's men, their horses restless, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. The morning felt stretched too tight, as if a single breath might snap the world in half. Gideon did not look at her when he spoke. "They'll come inside the fence if I don't walk out first." Leona's heart thumped once, hard enough to make her swallow. She looked past him to the men on the ridge and felt no room for fear, only a deep, inexorable clarity. This was the moment all their days of quiet work had been leading toward. "I'll stay with the girls," she said. Her voice did not waver. He nodded once and started down the steps, his boots silent on the worn boards. She watched him cross the yard, watched the way the wind caught at the hem of his coat, watched the distance shrink between him and the men who had tried so many times to break what he had built. Nell and Ruby appeared at her side, drawn by the pull of something too large to be contained behind walls. Ruby's small hand found Leona's. Nell stood tall, her ledger clutched in both arms. In that instant, Leona knew that whatever happened next, her daughters would remember it all their lives. The way their mother did not flinch, the way their home did not bow. Words drifted across the fence line, low, flat, edged with threat. She could not hear them all, but she saw Creighton's man gesture with his chin toward the house, saw Gideon shake his head once, deliberate and unhurried. When the rider leaned forward in his saddle, his hand dropping to the butt of his gun, Leona felt the air draw tight around her throat. But Gideon lifted one arm, palm out, and spoke in a voice that carried clear to the porch. "I have the governor's deed," he called. "Affidavits signed and witnessed. You want to press this, you'll find yourselves in court, and likely jail before the week is out." The man did not move. The horses stamped and blew, restless in the growing heat. For a moment that felt as long as a lifetime. No one breathed. Then Nell stepped forward, her small voice steady as iron. "We have the Springhouse map," she called. "I copied it myself. It proves this land was claimed fair, when your men were still stealing cattle in Oklahoma territory." Silence, enormous and ringing, fell across the yard. The rider turned his head, and though Leona could not see his face, she felt the moment he understood that no amount of threat could shift them now. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he straightened in the saddle. The 3 riders exchanged a look, then turned as one and began the slow descent back toward the ravine. Dust rose in soft columns behind them, dissolving into the morning light. Gideon stood motionless until they had vanished beyond the ridge. Only then did he lower his hand and draw a long, unsteady breath. When he turned back to the house, his eyes found Leona's and held them. No triumph gleamed there, no relief. Only the sober knowledge that for all they had won, the fight had come at a cost neither of them could yet name. But as he crossed the yard and climbed the steps, Leona felt something inside her loosen. A knot she had carried since the day she buried her husband, the day she decided she would never again let another man's greed determine her life. She glanced down at Nell and Ruby, at their bright, solemn faces, and knew she was not alone in that resolve. When Gideon reached the porch, he did not speak. Instead, he set his rifle aside and lifted his hand in a gesture as simple as it was enormous, an invitation without words, a recognition that in standing beside him, she had crossed some final threshold neither of them would ever retreat from. Leona took his hand. For the first time since she had stepped onto this land, she felt herself belong. In the days that followed, the ranch lay quiet in a way that did not feel like defeat. The fences still bore the scars of knives and hammers. The pastures showed the ragged trails of cattle driven to panic. But the house itself seemed subtly changed, as if the walls had taken note of their stand and decided, at last, to shelter them without reservation. Leona woke each morning to the hush before dawn and felt her heart settle into a rhythm that was no longer driven by fear. The threat had not vanished, but it had been named, faced, survived. Neighbors began to arrive in a slow trickle. Word of Creighton's retreat spreading through the sparse settlements and outlying homesteads. They came with spare boards for mending fences, buckets of nails, and quiet stories of their own trials. No one asked for payment. No one offered pity. This was the old code of the prairie. If you stood your ground when it mattered, your neighbors would stand with you when the dust began to settle. Gideon moved among them with a steadiness that Leona came to recognize as something deeper than stubbornness. It was gratitude made visible in every measured word, every long day spent driving fence posts alongside men he had once counted only as rivals. More than once she looked out the kitchen window and found him working shoulder to shoulder with Samuel Prentice, whose grazing rights had caused a dozen arguments in better years. And each time, she felt that old ache of loneliness recede another inch, replaced by a sense of belonging she had never dared expect. One afternoon, while the men hauled a fresh roll of wire to the north pasture, Nell and Ruby followed Leona to the place under the sycamores where the ground lay smooth and shaded. It was Gideon who had suggested it, that perhaps the girls needed a space of their own, a promise of something lasting. So they staked out the corners of a small cabin, the raw frame rising like a testament to what could be built, when survival was not the only ambition. Ruby danced barefoot among the foundation stones, her laughter threading through the branches overhead. Nell sat cross-legged on a flat rock, pencil scratching furiously in her ledger as she calculated the lengths of timber they would need. Leona watched them and felt a wonder so sharp it almost hurt. All her life she had measured worth in what could be endured: hunger, loneliness, a man's temper. But here, at the ragged edge of Texas, she was learning that there were other measures. What could be built, what could be tended, what could be chosen. That night, when the last of the neighbors had ridden back to their own spreads, Leona lingered by the kitchen window, watching the sycamores sway in the lantern glow. The half-built cabin looked small in the darkness, a fragile promise. But she understood in her marrow that it was also indestructible. It did not matter if storms came or drought followed. It mattered that they had chosen to lay those stones, to risk believing in something more than mere survival. Gideon came in from the yard, shoulders streaked with dust and sweat. He set a coiled length of rope on the table and turned to look at her, his face softened by exhaustion into something almost tender. "You think it'll hold?" he asked, nodding toward the window and the little shape taking form under the trees. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said simply. "It will hold." Neither of them spoke of what that cabin meant, what it would mean to live in a place where the girls could sleep without fear, where every nail and beam bore witness to a choice they had made together. But in the quiet that followed, with the wind easing through the eaves and the smell of fresh bread cooling on the sill, Leona felt her heart settle into a peace she had never known. It did not matter that no words of love had been spoken. Some bonds were forged in silence, in the shared weight of a life reclaimed. And as she turned back to the hearth, she knew that whatever storms waited on the horizon, she would not meet them alone. Autumn came as a slow, golden surrender. The cottonwoods along the creek turned the color of tarnished coins, their leaves falling in soft showers each afternoon. The air lost its harsh edge, carrying instead a mellow sweetness that clung to skin and hair. In the evenings, when the cattle drifted back toward the pens in gentle clusters, Leona would stand on the porch with Ruby perched on her hip and feel the season settle over the ranch like a benediction. They had survived the worst. Now they were learning how to live. The cabin under the sycamores rose in patient increments, floor joists laid with Gideon's careful precision, walls framed against the coming wind, a roof shingled with the help of neighbors whose names had become familiar. It was small, no more than 2 rooms, but it carried the quiet promise of permanence. When the last nail was driven and the door hung square in its frame, Ruby clapped her hands in wonder. "It's ours," she whispered, as if she feared the trees themselves might overhear and contradict her. Leona gathered her close, pressing her lips to her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart, it's ours." Inside the main house, the old hush had softened into something companionable. Gideon still rose before dawn, still moved through his days with the same measured discipline. But now Leona could see the difference in the way he paused in the doorway each evening, in the way his gaze found hers across the kitchen table. She did not mistake it for romance, not yet. It was something older and more reliable, a respect earned through shared labor and the quiet endurance of trouble. She had lived long enough to know that respect was the bedrock upon which everything else might one day stand. Nell had made a place for herself at the big table beneath the front windows, her ledger open beside the jars of preserves she helped Ruby label. Some afternoons, she would look up with that serious frown that always meant discovery, and Gideon would come to stand over her shoulder, listening as she explained the peculiarities of ranch accounting. Leona watched them, her daughter and the man she had once feared, and felt the shape of her world shift into something she had no name for, but which felt dangerously close to belonging. At night, when the work was done and the lamps burned low, Leona sometimes found herself sitting at the threshold of the little cabin. The sycamore leaves rustled overhead, their silver undersides catching the moonlight in slow, graceful flashes. She would close her eyes and let the cool air move over her skin, feeling every small ache and satisfaction of the day. In those moments, the past seemed far enough away to loosen its hold. The cabin was proof of it. No matter how many times the world had tried to strip her of dignity and purpose, she had claimed both with her own 2 hands. One evening, after the girls had gone to sleep, Gideon came to stand beside her in the doorway. He did not speak, only leaned one shoulder against the frame and looked out at the dark yard where the windmill turned in its slow, patient rhythm. They stayed that way for a long time, neither of them needing to fill the quiet. At last he shifted, his voice low and a little rough. "I never thought this house would feel like anything but empty." Leona turned to look at him, searching his face for any trace of jest. There was none. Just the simple truth of a man who had built everything except the thing he needed most. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on his forearm. "Maybe it was only waiting," she said, "waiting for something worth filling it." His gaze met hers in the lamplight, and for a moment she saw the man he might have been if life had been kinder. She did not love him. She was not sure she knew how to love any man after all she had endured, but she respected him. And sometimes, when the nights grew long and the wind spoke through the eaves, she suspected that might be the beginning of something worth trusting. They stood together in the doorway until the lamp burned down to a soft, flickering ember. The house behind them was quiet, but no longer hollow. And for the first time since she had climbed down from that coach and looked up at the forbidding mansion, Leona believed that whatever else life would bring, she and her daughters had found a place that could hold them, grief and all. Morning came soft as a benediction, the first light spilling across the sycamore leaves and painting the porch in pale gold. Leona stood at the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a mug of chicory coffee. The quiet was no longer a threat. It was an invitation. Outside, Ruby chased a stray chicken through the grass, her laughter ringing against the boards like a promise that this house, once so hollow, would never again be empty. She watched her daughter and felt the slow, steady ache of gratitude, not the wild, breathless joy of a young woman who still believed in grand romances and perfect endings. This was something older, quieter, a peace earned one small choice at a time, to stay, to endure, to risk believing that life could be better than what she had known. Behind her, Nell set her ledger carefully on the table and began arranging a row of jars filled with the summer's preserves. Her movements were methodical, her face bent over the task with the same concentration she had once given to the ledgers that saved the ranch. Leona felt a fierce tenderness rise in her chest. Her clever girl, who had found a way to make herself indispensable, who had shown them all that a child's mind could be sharp enough to change the course of grown men's ambitions. Gideon came in from the yard, the brim of his hat casting a shadow over his eyes. He paused just inside the door, as he always did now, as if to mark the transition from the world he ruled to the one he shared. He set a small sack of cornmeal on the table without comment and reached for the coffee pot. Their eyes met across the room. No shy glances, no startled turning away. Only the steady, wordless acknowledgement of two people who had weathered a season of trouble and found themselves still standing side by side. He poured his cup and leaned a hip against the counter. "The herd's holding steady," he said after a moment. "I'll need to ride to the south fence before noon. You think you and the girls can spare some of that bread for the hands?" "We'll have it ready," Leona replied. He nodded once, then hesitated. His gaze drifted past her shoulder to where the light caught the little cabin under the trees. "You're planning to move in soon?" Leona turned to look at it. Its roof sturdy, its door hung true, the windows waiting for curtains she had yet to sew. The thought of it no longer filled her with fear, only the quiet sense that something had come to rest inside her at last. "Soon," she said, "but not today." Gideon lifted his mug in a small salute. "When you do, you'll still come up to the house for supper." It was not a question. It was an offering, one she understood perfectly. "Of course," she answered. He looked down then, as if to conceal the softness in his eyes, and she turned back to the stove, feeling the warmth of that unspoken promise settle into her bones. Outside, Ruby caught the chicken at last, lifting it high in triumph. Nell called out, her laughter lifting clear and bright in the morning air. Leona closed her eyes for a moment, letting that sound wash over her like a hymn. She thought of all she had lost, her husband, her certainty, the narrow life she had believed was the only one she deserved, and felt none of the old bitterness. Loss had made her, but it had not ended her. When she opened her eyes again, the sun had cleared the last of the trees, lighting the yard with the gentle brilliance of a new day. The windmill turned slow and steady, measuring time in creaks and sighs. She took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch, the boards warm under her bare feet. In that moment she felt the truth as simply as she had ever known anything. This was no grand victory, no fairy tale ending, but it was enough. Enough to keep choosing, enough to keep trying, enough to believe that whatever tomorrow brought she would meet it standing, her daughters at her side. The memory of this golden morning folded safe inside her heart. And behind her, the old house stood quiet and waiting, no longer a monument to loneliness, but a refuge built by hands that knew the price of hope and had chosen it anyway.